In this video, we're going to take a look at two more loop structures that we can use in C#, the for loop and the ForEach loop. Both of these are just ways that you can tell C# to repeat a block of code, or loop through it a certain number of times. First, let's take a look at the for loop. We start with for, followed by parentheses, followed by curly brackets. Inside the brackets will be the code that will be looped through. Inside these parentheses is where the conditions will go that will decide how many times this block will loop. With a for loop, there are three values to pass in between these parentheses. The first value is the initial value that the loop will begin counting from. Let's create a variable, an integer, called I, and we'll set it to equal 0. In the parentheses, the first value we'll pass in is the I variable. The second value is an expression, just like we used in the last video with while loops. This is a condition that, if it evaluates to true, will cause this block of code to be run. So let's use I is less than 10. What this means is that while I is less than 10, this code will be run. Last, we can increment I with I++. What will happen is, I starts out equaling 0. C# checks if I is less than 10, which it is, and then it runs this block of code. After the code is run, it increments I by 1. Then the check is repeated again, if I is less than 10. It is, as it now equals 1. This will continue until I is equal to 10, at which point this expression will evaluate to false, and the loop will no longer be run. I'm going to create an array so we can see this loop in action. This array will contain strings, and I'll call it names. Names equals curly brackets, followed by a semicolon. I'll set the values to Ashley, Liara, Caden, Garrus, and Erdnot. Now I'll change the cutoff value of I to 5, which will cause this loop to repeat 5 times, as it starts from 0. Inside the brackets, I'll use the writeLine method to display each name. I'll just pass in the names array using I as the index. If we run the code, it writes each name to the console. If we wanted to just write the first 3 names, we could change the cutoff value of I to 3. Now we just get Ashley, Liara, and Caden. We don't have to start from 0 either. I'll change the cutoff value to 5, and I'll set the initial I value to 2. Now if we run the code, we start with Caden, the third name in the array. Also, you don't have to increment, you can decrement. I'll change the initial value of I to 4, and change this expression to I is greater than or equal to 0. Instead of incrementing I, I'll decrement it instead. If we run this code, it loops through each name in the array backwards. Now, let's loop through the names again, but this time using a ForEach loop. With a for loop, we specify the index and the number of times that the loop will be repeated. We choose to have it loop a certain number of times based on the expression we wrote. What if we wanted to loop through every value in the array? We could use a for loop, but there's a better way to do it. With a ForEach loop, it loops through each value in an array or collection. The ForEach loop has the same structure as the for loop, just type ForEach instead of for, followed by parentheses and curly brackets. Inside the parentheses, we use a temporary variable to store the value of the current index of the array. Since the names array contains string data type, this variable must be a string. So string name in names. This creates a temporary variable called name that will only be available inside these brackets. Name will be equal to the currently selected index in the names array, which will loop through from the first index to the last. Inside the brackets, we'll use the writeLine method and just pass in the name variable. If we run the app, we get Ashley, Liara, Caden, Garrus, and Erdnot. So it loops through each index in the names array, assigning it to the temporary variable name. We could have done that with a for loop though, so why would you want to use a ForEach loop as compared to a for loop? Well, with a ForEach loop, you can make sure that you loop through the code one time for every index in the array, no matter what the length. If you need to loop through every single index, a ForEach loop is the way to go. But if you want to decide how many times the code block will loop, use a for loop. You can write an expression for yourself that will determine how many times C# will loop through the block. Like if you wanted the first 3 names, even if the array had 20 names in it. In that case, you'd want to use a for loop and write an expression that would loop 3 times. In fact, you can do many of these things using either loop type, so in many cases it may come down to your personal preference and coding style, but it's still important to know how to use both the for loop and the ForEach loop, in case one may be more appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish.